confess that I've had like a really busy couple of days and did not get a lot of time to make a lot of notes for myself this evening. So I'm sort of winging it, but
It's okay.
sort of. But God does put on our hearts the words to speak. So we're just going to go with that. And I have I have wanted to talk about the third step and God's will in our lives and how we're approaching that in our recovery for a while. And I heard a podcast about it years ago, and I'm so glad that Cheryl put in this passage from First Thessalonians, because that's what the podcast was talking about. And I loved it. I loved how they were looking at that. So let's start first with in both our recovery and in our Christian walk, we are tasked with humbly seeking God's will. We are tasked with turning our lives and our will over to God. We made that decision in step 3 of the 12 steps. And if you haven't worked the steps, that's a good time for me to plug working the steps. And if you have worked the steps, then you will know that this is the first action step that we take, where we make a decision and we say, all right, it's not working my way. I'm going to make a decision to turn my life and my will over to the care of God. And most of us know that we have to make that decision over and over and over and over again. So it's not a one and done. So we have that format, we have that tool to use in our recovery, but in our Christian walk, we know that we're instructed over and over again to seek God's will, to humbly be obedient to what God has for us, and that is seeking God's will and not relying on our own understanding. So how do we do that? How do we, I mean, it's such a tall order. And the result is this lovely prayer, these actions in this prayer. But how do we get from that place of, I really just would like what I want, when I want it, immediately, right this minute, please, to, this prayer is seeking God's will. This is what happens when I am completely subservient to God's will. I am able to live with humility. I don't have to be consoled. I don't have to be served. I don't have to be looking for my own needs to be met by, these external resources, because I trust God is meeting my needs and that His will is right in front of me. And as long as I keep walking that path, there's really nothing that I need. So I can be of service with humility and not feel like, the old me would feel like I'm being taken advantage of. Hey, how come I did 4 things for them and they only did 2 things for me? Nope. Here's my resentment. Let's get on a roll here. That's my old brain. And my human brain continues to flare up like that all the time. So how do we seek God's will? And I loved this podcast because we tend to make it kind of complicated about how do I know if it's God's will or not? And I would hear people talking about that, about, well, I want to do this and I'm thinking about that, but I don't know if it's God's will. And like they're putting in their planner what to do over the next 10 years and which part of it is God's will and which part isn't. And how do they tell? Like there's these categories or these baskets that you're putting your actions in. And sure, sometimes there are decisions in front of us that we do, fervently seek to hear from God. which direction should I go? But most of our life, we are living in a routine and in a group and in a pattern. And hopefully it's a pattern with a strong spiritual practice. And when we veer off to self-will, it's us seeking something. We are seeking some kind of relief from discontent. We are seeking some kind of relief from fear. We're afraid of something. So most of the time that we veer into self-will, it is our brain and our circumstances, and we're unhappy with something. And so that starts brewing this idea that I'm gonna fix it. And that's usually my first mistake. Then several other mistakes follow. But my first mistake is I'm gonna fix it. And sometimes I'm perceiving a problem that isn't even there. So let's back up a little bit. And I'm gonna read the King James Version of 1 Thessalonians 5, 16, 17, and 18. So verse 16, that's an easy one to memorize. Rejoice evermore. 2 words, I love it. Verse 17, pray without ceasing. And verse 18, in everything give thanks, for this is the will of Christ Jesus concerning you. So we just got the roadmap to finding God's will. In fact, we don't even find it. We are in God's will. So God's will isn't something that we put in our planner and that we put our activities in a basket as God's will, not God's will, Teresa's will. Well, could it be put into the God's will basket if I think about it and talk about it, rationalize it enough? I think so. Let's put that one in God's will. That's not really how it works. If we back this all the way up, we remain in God's will. We don't do things or, we don't enter into God's will. We remain in his will as long as we practice these foundational, fundamental practices every day, every minute of every day, if we have to. And let's go over them again. Rejoice evermore. Pray without ceasing. In everything give thanks. For this is the will of Christ Jesus concerning you. A lot of versions use the word for the last verse is in all circumstances. Give thanks in all circumstances. And I really like that idea too, because the things that often derail us in our thinking and in our temptation to veer into self-will are our thoughts, what goes on between our ears, and our circumstances. And the worst combination is our thoughts about our circumstances. So as soon as something comes up that we're unhappy with, and then this engine starts going, we start veering into, I think I'm gonna fix it. And so we are not sitting in this stance of being in God's will. And what directive did we just ignore? Give thanks in all circumstances. We cannot be discontent with a circumstance and give thanks for it at the same time in general. There are people that, I guess I'm thinking of people who say, wow, this is hard, but I'm going to give thanks for it. But that's different than people who say, I hate this, and I'm going to give thanks for it. Because we're not really in a stance of being grateful for this circumstance if we are really, really pushing back against it. So once again, with humility, we are asking God to teach us how to put our will under his. So even though we don't like something or a circumstance is difficult, we are saying, I am grateful. I thank you. I look at this as a gift. I open my hands to it. And we can chat with God about it, of course we're going to chat with God about it. Which directive is that? Pray without ceasing. And I kind of feel like these are kind of backwards, the way these directives were given, because I feel like if you can start with the gratitude, follow with chatting with God, listening to God, pray without ceasing, that we get to the place where we rejoice evermore. But who am I? I'm not a critic. But to me, that's kind of the my process when I'm struggling with something, or when I know that I really have to live in this practice, this habit, this spiritual practice of remaining in God's will. Now, my brain flips me right out of it many, many, many times a day. So this is not a one and done any more than step 3 is. So, but people that are able to practice these steps and to understand that we practice them over and over and over again, this is step 3, where we have a difficult circumstance and we're trying to figure it out, and we're getting that feeling in our gut and in our solar plexus of, I'm getting more and more frustrated and tense and scared, and what's going to happen. And as my good friend puts it, we remember steps 1, 2, and 3. I can't. God can. I'm going to let him. And hopefully that leads us right to our roadmap. What about the situation am I grateful for? I'm grateful in all circumstances. So even though you may not feel, we don't have to feel it. Spiritual practice isn't about feeling. If it was about feeling, we'd all be in big trouble, because our feelings are fickle and our feelings lie. Feelings lie all the time. So you don't have to feel it, but you have to practice it. You have to decide to practice it. Part of step 3, we made a decision to practice this. So we become grateful for this situation. We go to God because we're not sure that we're grateful for all of it. We talk with him. We hear from him. We sit in humility as we pray with gratitude, but also with beseeching. I don't know what to do, but I'm going to sit here with you. What should I learn from this? What are you teaching me? What good will come of this? And what is my part in remaining in your will and in obedience? And God will answer us. He will lead us with the words from his Bible to us. He will lead us towards the action that keeps us in that stance of humility. Sometimes we want to talk to another person, an accountability partner, a person in our fellowship, somebody that will encourage us. We may want to listen to worship music. We may want to have to find other ways to help us to praise through this circumstance. And then our third part of our foundation is we realize that we are in God's hands, that we are right where God put us, and that God is present with us. So that is the reason that we rejoice evermore. There's no other reason. That God is present right with us, that he's unfailing. So all 3 of those things can be part of this practice. And we can then be assured that as we're practicing that we are in God's will. So part of my talk tonight, I was going to give a little testimony, which is when we're not in this practice, we can just make all kinds of decisions that hopefully we learn from. And I don't like to talk about this much because I'm still embarrassed by it, but about 3 years ago, I married somebody who I thought this was God's will. But it was one of those, get out my planner. I would like for this to happen, and this to happen. Self-will. And that came about because of discontent with my circumstances and with my thoughts about my circumstances. So 5 years ago, I was widowed for the second time, and I was very heartbroken and sad about that. And I made some decisions that I still think were fine at the time. And I sold the house we lived in, and I moved to an apartment because I felt like it was really hard to keep up with a property by myself. So I moved to an apartment, and I thought that was fabulous. It was like living in a hotel for 2 years. If your light bulb went out, you called somebody and they came and changed your light bulb. It was amazing. There was nothing wrong with it. But being the responsible citizen that I am, I thought that I should, resume owning a property. And I had all these fears and all these, I can't do it. And instead of this practice, I veered more and more into the idea that a smart man, no offense, fellas, would help me and would make this doable. And it was so strange. But that's what happens when we decide to not be in this practice, and when we let our brain lead us. And it wasn't a stunningly poor choice. I met a fella at a church in Vancouver. He seemed like a nice fella. He knew a lot about properties. So the poor guy, I've really had to like really pray about and write about and investigate what was my part in this. I had a big part in this. I was not going about this in a thoughtful way. I had been married twice before. After 3 to 7 year engagements, like datings, which I think that's my style. That's how I get to know somebody. I married this fellow 5 months after our first date, and I said, can you remodel a kitchen? I do. Neither of us were happy. It wasn't a stunningly poor choice in partnership, but it was stunningly poor when we tried to live together. And so we separated after 7 months, and that's why I can get away with never mentioning that ever happened. Yeah. But I'm gonna do it. I'm not only gonna mention it. I'm going to say that because I met him at church and because he's a Christian, my brain worked this into, this is God's will. This has to be God's will. So things that seem good, like, I don't know, there's other opportunities maybe that we decide we want to pursue. And they seem like good opportunities. So it's not a difference between good and bad. It's a difference between, is this what God has for me? And am I in this stance? Am I making a decision every single minute of every day to engage in this practice? And instead of being grateful for the circumstance I was in and the opportunity that was in front of me, and then spending time praying about that opportunity, and I have fears, God. I don't know if I can do this by myself. I don't know if I'm equipped. God would have held my heart, that he would have shown me the way to move forward without this bizarre derailment. big time derailment. But that's where our self-will gets us, is these weird derailments. It's the only reason I'm telling that story. So it's an example of how we can get derailed if we're not in this practice. And then finally, to be in the stance of, as he holds me and tells me and comforts me and says, I will lead the way, that I'll make the way, and you just keep following. You just keep doing this practice, that finally I can rejoice evermore. And then I'm not looking for derailment. I'm not looking over here for some wackadoodle solution to my made-up problem. It was a made-up problem because I had departed from this rigorous practice. So the final thing I'm going to say about this is don't get married after dating somebody for 5 months. No, but what, you know me, I am very much a person that says, if you want to change how you're thinking or how you're approaching decision making, then you have to make a commitment to a practice. So each of these components in those 3 verses have practices and habits that you can adopt. So the one thing that I would say is the practice of praying without ceasing is a practice that we often think of as talking, as communing with God or through conversation, that we are conversing, that we have to be talking this whole time. And that's not the only way that people pray. People can pray in silence. One, God is with us and knows what is going on between those ears and in that heart. Mm-hmm. So we don't have to talk. It is good to talk, but it is really for our benefit that we are speaking out our heart to God. And God hears us, but then he hears what we don't say as well. So sitting in silence and listening and breathing and knowing that God's peace is upon us is a very important and valid form of prayer as well. And one of my favorite verses is Psalm 62 that says, or 62:5 that says, "For God alone my soul waits in silence and quietly submits to him, for my hope is from him." So that verse uses silence twice. And the other benefit to this is a lot of our derailment and our difficulty with staying in these practices is the noise in our head. So not only is it a great prayer practice, but it's also just a great practice to have to value and embrace this coming to God in silence and to quietly submit to him and submit to his will. So that's what I got. Thank you.
Wow. Good job, Teresa.